Wenatchee, and then we will be in Spokane on Monday and Tuesday, and we'll be back in Seattle on Tuesday night. And we have just in the last previous few days been in Shelton and Everett and Whidbey and Puyallup and University Place, and I'm leaving out a few others. But we're moving all across the state. And I got to you, wherever I go, and this is not just a line, this is true. Wherever I go, and even in different types of groups, people are saying, Bill, it's time for new leadership in Olympia. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about what kind of leadership I would like to bring to Olympia. And I'll focus on a question that I was asked just a few weeks ago. I was in Chinatown at a group, and I've run for office twice in King County, so I've campaigned already a lot in Chinatown over the years. But this was a group of really kind of independent to maybe even Democratic voters who didn't know me. And I gave my little spiel, and we asked a lot of questions. And this one lady right in the front row raised her hand, and she said, well, Bill, tell me how you're different from Jay Inslee. And I said something very glib right off the top of my head, like, oh, in so many ways, and rattled off a few ways that I thought I was different from the governor. But when I got back in the car, I thought, that is a very good question. And in a year of campaigning, and I announced in May of 2015, so we've already been on the campaign trail for a year. In a year of campaigning, no one had ever asked me that question. How are you different from Jay? And so I began thinking about what a better answer would have been. And I came up with 3 ways that I am different from Jay, and I'd like to share those with you today, so that after leaving here, somebody says, well, who is this Bill Bryant guy, and how's he different from the guy we've got in there now? You can fall back on some of these 3 ways and share them with others as well. Well, there are 3 ways that I want to share with you that I think I'm different from the governor. They're rooted in the same point, and that is that my career has been spent in the private sector. I've built a company over the last 24 years that operates on both sides of the mountains. And Jay Inslee has spent his entire career in elected political office, and a lot of that in Congress. And I think that shapes the way we look at leadership and the way we look at policy issues and the way we govern. And so let me share with you some of those differences as I see them. And the first is leadership. We have very different styles. Jay Inslee has introduced and this is not a partisan statement. I think you can talk to Republicans or Democrats and they will agree on this, at least Republicans and Democrats who work with him in Olympia, that he has introduced a very hyper-partisan, divisive style to Olympia. It may be how we do or don't do business in the U.S. Congress, but it isn't how we have done business traditionally at the state capitol. And it's not working. I have a very different style, and my style I really learned in terms of leadership when I worked for the Apple industry. Give you a little bit of background about myself. I was born in Morton. Does anybody know where Morton is? We're on the White Pass Highway. Dad, however, I didn't live there very long because shortly after I was born, Dad got a job teaching school in the Hood Canal School District over on the Olympic Peninsula. So I grew up in Hoodsport and went to school on the Skokomish Reservation. Went to high school in Olympia, went back east to Georgetown and earned a degree in trade and diplomacy, and then came home and worked for Governor Spellman on international trade issues. And after Governor Spellman lost, I helped get Governor Gardner squared away, and then I moved to Yakima. And I was asked or hired to do the international trade negotiations for Washington's apple industry. And my job was to open new export markets for Washington's apples all around the world. And that's where I learned some important lessons in leadership. And I learned, at least for me, you lead by building coalitions. Because what I had to do for the Washington apple industry was to open up export markets for a growing crop. When I was hired, the apple industry was growing about 35 million boxes of apples every year. And they knew within a few years they were going to begin harvesting 50 million boxes. And so what they wanted was for me to begin opening up new export markets, so when these larger crops came off the trees, they would have markets for them, they could sell them profitably. So I'd have to go to a country that was not allowing our apples to be shipped there, for example, Mexico. When I was hired, Mexico took 0 apples from the United States. It was illegal to ship apples to Mexico. Today, Mexico will take about 10% of the crop, but at the time they took 0. So what I'd have to do is I'd have to get on a plane, go down to Mexico City or whatever the capital was that was involved, and I'd have to meet with the Ministry of Trade and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Agriculture and say, okay, why aren't you letting our apples in? And if I met with 3 ministries, I usually got 3 different answers. And I'd have to work with the foreign government to get them on the same page and have them agreeing on what it would take for us to ship our apples to their country. And generally they wanted them grown slightly differently or packaged differently or inspected differently or something. Then I'd come back to Washington State, to Wenatchee and Yakima, and say to the apple guys, okay, great, good news. Now you can ship your apples to this country, but you're going to have to package them differently or store them differently or something. And generally the guys say, well, we're not going to do that. You know, I mean, we don't do that for any other country. Why do we have to do it for this country? And I say, you know, settle down. Let's figure out how you can do what you need to do commercially, but at the same time begin to accommodate the requests of the foreign government. And then I'd have to go to Washington, D.C. and meet with our own Department of Agriculture and our own U.S. Trade Representative and make sure they were comfortable with what we were negotiating with the foreign government. And many times they would have to actually be part of the negotiations or take over the negotiations if it was a government-to-government agreement. It was three-dimensional chess. You had to keep the U.S. government, the foreign government, and the U.S. industry all moving in the same direction. And you did that by building a coalition of people in each of those groups. And you identified the endpoint that you wanted to reach. And you identified how each of those groups would benefit by getting to that endpoint. So that when you had disagreements, which inevitably will occur in the course of a negotiation, it didn't break down the negotiations because everybody had an understanding of why they wanted to get to that endpoint because it would benefit them in some way. That is exactly the kind of leadership we need right now in Olympia, and it's exactly the kind of leadership we do not have. If you need one statistic to show how divisive Governor Inslee has been, it's this one. In 8 years, his predecessor, Governor Gregoire, in 8 very difficult economic years, had 7 special sessions. Jay Inslee, in 3.5 years, has had 7 special sessions. He's proven repeatedly an inability to pull people together in the legislature, focus on an endpoint, and deliver a budget on time. And that's one of the paramount responsibilities of the governor. We need a governor who can do that. The second issue is taxes. Governor Inslee, when he was a candidate, campaigned that he would veto any tax increase. He didn't just say it once, he said repeatedly that he would veto a tax increase. His hand, ladies and gentlemen, was barely off the Bible after having been sworn in before he ran back to his office and began proposing over $1 billion in new taxes. It's not how I operate. We went to the apple industry in '85. By 1992, I had opened up enough markets around the world that a lot of other agricultural groups and food and beverage companies around the United States were calling me and asking me for advice. So they'd say, Bill, we got a problem in Germany, or we have a problem in Australia, what would you do? And I'd tell them what I'd do. And after giving out free advice for a few months or years, I thought, you know, there's an opportunity here. So my wife, Barbara, and I moved to Seattle, and I set up my company that does international trade negotiations for a lot of food and beverage companies around the United States and a lot of agricultural groups. And I have started that company in the basement. It was just me and a phone and a fax machine. But we've been very fiscally disciplined. And as a result, I've run that company in the black every month since its second month. I took that same fiscal discipline to the public sector. In 2007, a seat was coming up for re-election on the King County Seattle Port Commission. And I was very concerned that the King County Seattle Port Commission was not being run very fiscally responsibly because the commission raised the property tax to the maximum legal amount every year, to the maximum legal amount, whether it needed it to or not, just because they could. And my concern was because they were just constantly raising taxes, they weren't asking themselves some very tough questions, and they weren't setting priorities. And I thought, unless they step back and exercise some fiscal discipline and begin setting some priorities, we weren't going to be in a position to handle some competitive threats that I knew were coming at us in 8 to 10 years right now. And so I ran on a platform of fiscal conservatism, and even though I was a Republican running in King County, won, and began working with the staff on the budget that year, and said, you know, we've got some assets that are performing well, but they're tethered to assets that aren't. If we divested ourselves and kind of separated those, and there's some programs here that, you know, with some minor modifications could probably be a lot more efficient, I think we can put together a budget that would hold the property tax flat. I thought I was going to be a hero. But there were staff that thought they had this young rogue commissioner on their hands who doesn't understand the drill, and that is that we raise the property tax to the maximum legal amount every year, whether we need to or not, because we can. And I said, wait, look, we're going to be setting some priorities, and we need to begin moving in a direction that will allow us to be globally competitive and keep jobs here in the next decade. And this budget's the first step in doing that. And began building the coalitions and put together the votes I needed. And that year we passed a property tax that held it flat. And I'll tell you, I was on the commission for 8 years. And every year we passed a budget that either held the property tax flat or cut it in real terms. So much so that the last budget I voted on in November of 15 collected millions of dollars less from the people of King County than that first budget 8 years before, even though we expanded services to the people of King County and Washington State.
Wow.
Contrast that to what happened in the 2015 legislative session, where we had billions of dollars in new revenue. And when the revenue projections came out, we had a few $100 million that we weren't even anticipating. And the governor still wanted either a carbon tax or a cap and trade tax or a capital gains income tax, even though he couldn't explain what he was going to do with it. He just wanted a new tax. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we have an absence of revenue in Olympia. I think we have an absence of leadership in the governor's office, and it needs to change. And the third area, which is really different, is strategic vision or strategic planning. And again, that's something I learned from the apple industry. Remember, they hired me when they had a 35 million box crop, and they knew they were going to have 50 million boxes coming off the trees. They didn't wait until they had 50 million boxes coming off the trees to hire me and begin opening up new export markets. They did it years before they knew they were going to need those markets. They taught me that you've got to be thinking 4, 7, and 10 years out. That you need to make sure that what you're planting today is what you want to harvest in 4 and 7 years. And when I set up my company, I remembered that lesson, and I sat down and put together a strategic plan on how I wanted my company to evolve and where I wanted to be in 4 and 7 and 10 years, and put all of my resources, all of my efforts into implementing that plan. And because we did, and with my business partners, we're not in the basement anymore with a phone and a fax machine. We have operations in Seattle and Sacramento. We have about 35 employees. We have projects in 20 to 30 countries at any given time. That's because we had a plan and we focused on it. When I was elected to the Port Commission, I was concerned that we were not focusing on some of those competitive threats that were coming at us. And that if we didn't, we were going to lose thousands of jobs to British Columbia. And one of the things that we really needed to do was to consolidate the seaports of Seattle and Tacoma. And so in January 2009, I put together the first proposal to consolidate the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. Talk about being patted on the head and said, go get them. I was told, that's a great idea, but that's not how we do business here. It's never been done. It will never happen. But I began pulling together the coalitions, working with people in Pierce and King County, identifying not the objective wasn't just to merge the ports for merging the port's sake, but we wanted to consolidate the ports so that we could keep jobs here in Washington State, and focused everybody on the fact that this was a means to keeping jobs in Washington. And as we continued to build the coalition, more and more people became involved. And by the end of it, we had a lot of people who were responsible for the success. But in August of 2015, we signed the agreement consolidating the seaports of Seattle and Tacoma into a single entity, creating the third largest port gateway in North America. LA Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, Puget Sound. And we have let the world know we're going to fight to keep those jobs in Washington State. I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I have done this in the private sector for my company. I've worked with the strategic plan in the public sector with the Port of Seattle. And as your governor, I'll do it for the people of Washington State. Jay Inslee, he has no strategic plan. And that's really unconscionable when you think about all the assets we have to work with here in Washington. I mean, think about what we have that generates jobs in Washington State. We have trade and transportation. We have tourism. We have technology. We have medical science, medical research, global health. We have manufacturing. We have the military. We have agriculture. We have forestry. We have fisheries, and we have energy. We have all 10. There are some states that would love to have 3 or 4 of those. Arizona, New Mexico, Arkansas. They'd love to have 4 of those. We have all 10. But what we don't have is a strategic plan on how to take the regulatory power of the state and the budget of the state and use them in a way that helps the private sector generate jobs in each of those 10 sectors. If you're a CEO and you don't have a strategic vision or a strategic plan, for the most part, what you've done is you put your company into a maintenance mode. But if you're a governor and you don't have a sense of where you want these departments in the state to be in 10 years, then what happens is the budget is no longer a document that helps you drive in any particular direction. A budget's just a political document, whatever it needs to be to get 50 votes in the House, 25 in the Senate, and that you're willing to sign so the legislature will go home. But that's not driving us in any particular direction. If you're a governor and you don't have a real sense of where you want the state to be in 10 years, you've essentially turned over your government to the regulators and to the bureaucrats. And when you do that, you get a culture of no. I have a friend who runs a company here in Washington State, and he called me the end of September, and he said, Bill, it's not public yet, but I want to give you a heads up. We're going to be moving 300 or 400 jobs out of Washington State next year, which is this year. And I said, okay, why? And he said, there's just a culture of no in Olympia, and I'm getting tired of it. He said, every time I want to do something, I've got an agency telling me why I can't do it, and the way they want me to do it's not going to pencil out. He said, I don't know how, but this other governor heard about it, and he asked me to fly down and meet with him. And when I got down there, that governor had 2 agency heads in the cabinet room, and they spent all day with me talking about how I could get done what I want to get done in their state. He said, we're going to try it out. We're going to move 300 or 400 jobs down there and see how it works. He said, until you can turn this culture of no into a culture of yes, good family wage jobs are going to keep leaving Washington. Mm-hmm. So how do I, as your governor, how do I take this culture of no and turn it into a culture of yes? How do we change the culture in Olympia? Well, let me tell you, there's a few ways. Number one, on day one, we are going to bring in a new leadership team, and we will replace all of the ineffective department heads from the top as far down as we can possibly go. On day one, I'm going to announce a zero-based budget initiative that will take 4 years to implement. But over the course of 4 years, we are going to rebuild the state budget from zero up. We'll set strategic objectives for every department, and then we'll look at every agency, every program, and every tax incentive. And if it's not moving us towards those strategic objectives, I'll work with the legislature to fix them or eliminate them. On day one, we're going to announce a moratorium on all new regulations until the departments can justify the regulations that we've already got. And when I lift that moratorium, we will have a fixed sunset review date on every new regulation. We can do that in 4 years. And if we do that in 4 years, we'll provide the state with the strategic direction and the strategic vision it needs to generate jobs in communities all across Washington State. Those are the 3 ways we're different. It's a leadership style. It's a focus on fiscal responsibility. And it's using the state to generate jobs in communities all across Washington. We can do that. And with your help, in November, we'll get started. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to ask you something. Do you have that speech written